So yeah, good morning to those of you joining from Alberta, and good evening to the folks joining from Germany. Thanks to everyone for joining this online seminar today. I'm really happy to be here to share some of the research that I've been working on with you. I know, fortunately, I had the opportunity to connect with many of you in person in Munich. So I'd like to build upon some of the research that I showed in the shorter talk in Munich at LMU. And for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet yet, hopefully we'll be able to meet in person at some point. But I'll provide sort of a high level overview of some of the research that I'm working on. So as you just heard, I'm Scott Ketcheson. I did get to meet most folks here, which is awesome. I'm an assistant professor at Athabasca University, where I'm also a Canada Research Chair in hydrological sustainability. So I know from attending my first ABINet meeting that there's quite a broad range of research topics that folks within ABINet are working within. And for myself, I'm very much a field-based hydrologist. So my chair title's in hydrological sustainability. So what I'd like to think my research team and I are doing is working towards ecosystem sustainability through understanding hydrological processes. So I'm very much a field-based hydrologist. I study the movement of water between forests and wetlands in the northern part of our province here, Alberta. And that's what I'll be talking to you about today, are really water availability, wetlands, and resource extraction in Alberta's Boreal Plain. So I didn't know how many folks would be here who I didn't get the chance to meet in Munich, but I thought I'd just reiterate and re-highlight as a relatively new ABINet member where I fit within ABINet sort of structure and where I can contribute to ABINet's core topics and key research approaches, and where I see my research really fitting is in this impact of energy development on ecosystem processes, as you might imagine, with a focus on hydrological processes. And so that's where I fit, I think, within the core topics in ABINet. And then the key research approaches, I highlighted some of the new strategies of data acquisition that I've rolled out at some of my research sites, not necessarily remote sensing, but using wireless sensor networks and this sort of intelligent catchment design that I'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the details there on that sort of key research approach or new strategy for data acquisition that I've rolled out at my research sites. So I'd like to start with this picture. This is a beautiful landscape in northern Alberta. If you haven't had the chance to be there, this is looking out on the northern part of the province in the Boreal Plain. And I'd just like to take a second to reflect and be thankful for the fact that I'm able to work within this area. That's the Treaty 8 region of Alberta. And I'm really fortunate to be able to conduct research in such a beautiful landscape. So to set the scene with a bit of context, this is, like I said, it's a picture looking out on the northern part of the province, which I thought would be valuable for those of you who haven't been there. But it's really a beautiful mosaic of forests, wetlands, and water courses. And the way in which these landscapes exchange water is quite complex. What I like about this image that I don't think comes across clearly, which is maybe kind of a nice thing, is, and maybe some of you aren't aware, but there are a lot of wetlands in this region. About half the landscape are wetlands. And because of that, wetlands play an important ecological and hydrological role in this setting. Now, this is really interesting, especially from a hydrological perspective, because this is in the context of quite a dry climate. So this area is designated as a subhumid climate, and that's pretty dry. And in spite of that, half the landscapes are wetlands. So we only receive about 450 millimeters of precipitation annually. And the majority of that arrives as rainfall over the course of the snow-free period. And that the timing of the rainfall really corresponds with the water demand. So basically the peak water availability, it coincides with peak water demand by vegetation and evapotranspiration. And often we can see potential evapotranspiration exceeding precipitation. So this is really I'm trying to give you a sense that this is really quite a subhumid water limited setting. And that's why I think it's really important, since half the landscape are wetlands, to understand what happens to the water that is in this landscape, what controls its storage, movement, and release. Now, the other thing that's interesting, you can see in this picture, there are a lot of water bodies, got quite a lot of rivers that flow through this region. And because of this subhumid climate, we see variable but typically low runoff in these catchments. And again, typically low runoff efficiencies. So that's the proportion of rainfall that lands on a catchment that leaves as runoff. So how much water is generated, per rainfall input, and that's typically low. Like, we expect these catchments anywhere between 1 to 30% of rainfall to be produced as runoff, which is fairly low. Now, a lot of these big river systems that flow through this part of Canada have headwaters in the Rocky Mountains. So these are, the gorgeous Rocky Mountains. If you've come out for the course in Kananaskis, those are often referred to as the water towers of the West, and they provide, the true headwaters for some of these big river systems. But I think that there are some important supplementary headwater reaches that are present within the mid to lower reaches of these big river basins that we don't understand the importance of water generated there quite as well as we understand the importance of the water in the true mountains. So I'll tell you about Alberta's northern mountains a little bit today. But all this builds to my central research goal, which is really around understanding the mechanisms and processes that control freshwater generation in these wetland regions and these sort of supplementary headwater systems, and then trying to understand the importance of the water generated within these landscapes for down gradient ecosystems and receiving water bodies and regional rivers. So specifically, I'm working in a big river basin here in Alberta called the Athabasca River Basin. So it is quite a large river basin with its headwaters in the true headwaters in the actual mountains in Alberta. You can see to the southwest part of the province here, and it flows along to the northeastern part of the province. And during this course, it drains huge areas in Canada's Boreal Plain. So this is looking at some of the terrestrial ecozones across Canada, and here is Alberta, and you can see a big swath right around where the Athabasca River Basin flows is the Boreal Plain ecozone. So as the river flows from the mountainous headwaters through to its outlet, the volumetric flow in the river increases. And that's because it's draining larger and larger area, which we expect. But what's interesting is that on a per unit area basis, the basin becomes less productive as the river flows through these mid to lower reaches that I mentioned are these subhumid climates. So that's, again, why I think it's really important to understand what happens with the rainfall that arrives in these water limited settings, what controls the storage and release of that water. And then we can understand as well, in the context of disturbance, which of these processes are most sensitive to change. And so now I'll layer a map here that generalizes Canada's anthropogenic footprint across the whole country. And you can see that there's quite a concentration, as you would expect in the southern parts of the country where most of the population is. But over here in Alberta, you can see that this footprint really does extend quite a fair bit into the northern part of the province. And so although a lot of that is, of course, driven by forestry, the other thing that is really driving that I think a lot of people here are familiar with are the Alberta oil sands. So again, this is a map of the province of Alberta, and it highlights the location of the three major oil sands deposits within our province, in the northern part of our province. And this collectively, these three deposits are referred to as the Alberta oil sands, and they represent the fourth largest oil reserves in the world. So after Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So especially our colleagues in Germany will think that this is a really large area that they cover. So the oil sands, the three areas collectively underlie over 142,000 square kilometers. And the Athabasca, which are the central and largest deposit, and the Cold Lake to the southeast, and the Peace River oil sands. So this is a huge area beneath which there are these large deposits of oil sands. And only some of these, a small proportion actually, are shallow enough to mine through surface mining. And so this, you can see this is Fort McMurray, which many people have probably heard about, right in sort of the northeastern part of the Athabasca oil sands. And right above it is that area in tanned that looks quite small. That's the surface mineable area. And so that actually, in area, it's quite large, almost 5,000 square kilometers. But as a proportion of the total oil sands deposit, it's only about 3.5, a little under 3.5%. So as a collective amount of the total oil sands, it's quite small. But of course, this is surface mining, and so it's quite destructive for the landscape. And that's probably where you've seen, pictures of the big open pit mines. That's all in the surface mineable area. And so these are where the McMurray deposit, which is the bitumen-bearing formation, if it's within the upper 75 meters or so, they basically do the surface mining. If the deposit is deeper than 75 meters, they generally collect and extract the oil using what we sort of generally refer to as in situ techniques. So there are a couple variations on the way in which that works, but all of them pretty much involve, maybe not all of them actually, but they generally involve horizontal drilling and steam injections, and they pump the bitumen out in that way. And so you can imagine they have very different footprints. The surface mineable area, they basically scrape away the surface of the boreal and anything that overlies the McMurray Formation. And then the reclamation of that landscape is really reconstructing landscapes and catchments from scratch. And so it's quite the undertaking. And I'm involved in some of that reclamation hydrology research that I'll talk a little bit about today. But then there's a large footprint caused from in situ extraction as well. But the nature of it is much different. They have a lot of linear features on the landscape, such as roads, pipelines. And one thing that is sort of universal across all of these areas are seismic lines. And so that's one thing I'll talk about as well. And that's my involvement, as Julia mentioned, in the BERA project, or the Boreal Ecosystem Recovery and Assessment Program, that's ran out of U of C by Greg McDermott. So they have these corridors that are cleared so that they can map out the deposits. They're pretty much everywhere. And then there are in situ infrastructure that I'm studying the influence that has on water movement. And then there's also open pit mining extraction. And of course, just to remind you where the Athabasca River Basin is, you can see I've overlain it here over top of the province. And you can see here's Fort McMurray in the mid to lower reaches, sort of right in the center of the Athabasca River Basin. Here's Fort McMurray as well. So you can see that the river basin runs directly through the Athabasca oil sands and encompasses all of the surface mineable area. So it's really important to understand the influence of resource exploration and extraction and recovery and reclamation on the way that water moves through these landscapes. So that's sort of how I structured my research program, is around this sort of disturbance spectrum from natural and relatively undisturbed catchments through to the exploration in situ, and then also the reclamation and reclamation hydrology, and understanding the design of completely constructed catchments. So this again provides sort of a snapshot overview of some of my different research sites and projects that I'm working on, the majority of which you can see Fort McMurray is here. And the majority of my research sites are to the north and south of Fort McMurray. You might notice this one sort of outlier here. I do some work with Ducks Unlimited at their Boreal Wetland Center, which is out near Grand Prairie. So I won't be talking about that today. I'll just be focusing within these more industrially disturbed settings within the lower reaches of the Athabasca River Basin. So when I set out to start my research program a couple of years ago, I was really interested in studying these natural catchments. I wanted to know, why are there so many wetlands? How do wetlands exchange water with adjacent forests? And are they really important areas to provide water for the Athabasca River Basin as supplementary headwater reaches away from their actual headwater of the big catchment itself. So I set out and established what I named the Stony Mountain Headwater Catchment Observatory. And, I could put mountain in quotes, and I'll tell you why. Northern Alberta has some little mountains, and that's where I rolled out this wireless sensor network technology that I'll talk a bit about as well. But this is also kind of what led me to ultimately to ABINet, but really through first meeting Greg and Julia and becoming involved in BERA, as I mentioned, that I think most people are familiar with. So this is a picture from Stony Mountain and my research sites, and like the wolves, I guess, who use these seismic lines to effectively predate caribou, which is a problem. The researchers use them as effective modes of transportation because it's a lot easier to drag equipment and walk down these seismic lines. So basically, within the Headwater Catchment Observatory, we're using seismic lines to get to all the research sites, putting instrumentation off of them. And then once I got involved with Greg and Julia, and then we thought, well, we can now start to study the seismic lines in the Headwater Catchment Observatory as well. And now, I'm happy to be working a lot more closely and collaborating with Ralph as well. And we're co-supervising some students who are a part of ABINet that I'll talk about as well. And so, I started looking at natural, relatively undisturbed catchments, then looking at the exploration footprint within those catchments. We also recently had a grant that we're just starting up this coming summer, looking at the influence of some of the in situ footprint on the way that water moves, especially with respect to which wetland types are sensitive to this type of infrastructure and water movement. So we're looking at doing some work in an in situ facility over the next 5 years. And then, as I've mentioned, I also work right in the middle of the open pit surface mineable area where I'm working on understanding the processes and system design within a constructed upland that's supplying water to a pit lake, which is essentially aquatic capping as a reclamation and closure design plan in the open pit mines. You see down here, there's also a little bit of work that I do with Canada wildfire, because this is also a landscape that has a natural disturbance cycle, in particular wildfires. I'm doing a lot of work in wetlands, and there's some, there's a lot of smoldering potential in organic soils. So we're looking at mapping out some of the thicknesses of organic soils across these catchments and understanding what controls their moisture levels and subsequently their fire risk. So to talk about some of Northern Alberta's mountains, and you can see I've got that in quotes here because they're just tiny compared to the actual mountains. When I was in Germany, I popped down to Austria and spent some time in the mountains out there. So they're totally different than Northern Alberta's mountains as well. But you can see to the southwestern part of the province, these are the proper mountains, the Rocky Mountains. But if you look up, here's Fort McMurray, and you can see there are some of these sort of yellow areas, like little topographic highs. And so these are erosional upland landforms, which is boring to say, so we call them mountains. But there are a number of these mountains or erosional upland landforms scattered across the northern part of the province. And in spite of their relatively small geographical footprint, I think that they have a disproportionately large hydrological impact on the water movement in this region. And I'll tell you why. So I'm working, as I said, on Stony Mountain. So to orient you, this is Fort McMurray here. This is the Athabasca River, about 40 kilometers south of Fort McMurray. You can see this is one of these mountains, Stony Mountain in particular. And when we overlay the stream network on top of the surface elevation, we can see that there are streams that drain radially off of Stony Mountain. And so looking at this in sort of a 3D image, looking west to east, you can see that there are all these stream networks that drain off of the western edge of Stony Mountain. And there's a river that flows along this western edge and around here called the Hanging Stone River, which is actually a reasonable tributary eventually to the Athabasca. So it's basically collecting all this water that's draining off of Stony Mountain and bringing it to the Athabasca River itself. And so I was involved a number of years ago in a study unrelated to this, but really that inspired this on Stony Mountain, where we were studying a catchment because we thought that there was something interesting to be seen on here. And what we did was we compared the amount of rainfall received on Stony Mountain to that was received at the Fort McMurray Airport, which is where the 30-year climactic data is based upon. We found that there's a lot more rainfall received on Stony Mountain. So this is a plot that's looking at rainfall by month, and this represents 4 years of data. And so we looked at the amount of rain received on Stony Mountain compared to the airport, 20 kilometers away, and we saw that there's about 55% higher than expected based on the 30-year climactic normal data. So just because Stony Mountain's a couple hundred meters above the surrounding low-lying area, it receives more rainfall. And I think that's why we see all these streams that drain radially off of Stony. Now that first study sort of inspired why I wanted to set up this entire Stony Mountain Headwater Catchment Observatory. So this comprises 5 small headwater catchments. So they're all less than 10 square kilometers, which is really tiny from a watershed hydrology perspective. And the smallest is even less than half a square kilometer. So these are really small catchments. They all feature a central wetland. And I think that they're really the inception point of these streams in this mid to lower reaches part of the Athabasca River, where I wanted to understand what's happening. And so this is where each of these different catchments I've instrumented with transects of wells and piezometers and various sensors. And the general approach was to put transects that spanned from the forest through to the wetland back to the adjacent forest, so that we can start to evaluate these forest land, wetland, water exchanges. And all of them we're measuring and quantifying catchment discharge and runoff. And so we're trying to understand if these catchments are generating more water than we expect on a regional basis, and if so, under which conditions are they generating the most. Now, the other thing that we've rolled out here is a wireless sensor network that I'll talk about in a minute. But all of these little catchments basically are then nested in these larger mesoscale catchments. So those are all under 10 square kilometers. These are upwards of almost 200 square kilometers, which is still considered pretty small from a catchment hydrology perspective, but we're measuring stream flow at these locations as well. And all of that is basically nested within, this is the Athabasca River Basin as a whole, divided out by the subcatchments that the government here through the Water Survey of Canada monitors the flow at these stations. So all of those are nested within one subcatchment of the Athabasca River Basin. So one thing that I'm really trying to do with this research program is provide some of that process-based information at a smaller scale than is typically available, which is, this sort of subcatchment scale that are on the order of thousands of square kilometers. Now, we don't have tons of information at the scale which I'm working, and I think that is in part because of this contextual challenge here, because they're hard to get to. And, we seem to know a lot about areas that are easy to get to, that are near to roads and that kind of thing, which is fair. And I understand, certainly after having done it for a couple of years now, why. But of course, accessibility doesn't dictate hydrological importance. And so, there are certain things that are happening in these regions that are hard to get to that I think are really important to understand. And some of this, I think, is reflected in modeling, hydrological modeling successes and performance. So, on the whole Athabasca River Basin scale, hydrological models perform really well in the mountainous regions, but they don't perform exceptionally well in the mid to lower reaches of the basin. And I think that's in part due to a lack of sufficient process-based information to adequately parameterize these models in the mid to lower reaches, where often these places are hard to get to. So that's sort of the challenge in working in these remote headwater catchments. I know some of the students who came over through ABINET this past summer had the opportunity to traverse around Stony Mountain, and they have an appreciation for this challenge. But basically, this is looking at the collection of a cluster of a few of these small small catchments. And keep in mind, this is very small from a headwater or from a hydrological like catchment perspective. But this was a typical day. The road was in bad shape, so we had to park there. And then we walked down the road. And then, as I said, we sort of walk along all these seismic lines and visit these various stream crossings where we do stream flow measurements, measure wells and piezometers, check on instruments, and back. And that loop was over 10 kilometers in a day. So this is really hard walking. It's, hip waders across wetlands, up over forested hill slopes, back down into wetlands. It's pretty tiring. So there's not a ton of people. Like I trick some people into into coming with me, but not a ton of people love doing that kind of thing. Fortunately, I've been lucky to find people who do. But this is sort of the logistical challenge in understanding some of these remote areas. But early on in my research program, I was fortunate to partner with a tech development company called Riot. And so that they're a small Canadian company based in British Columbia, and Riot stands for the Remote Internet of Things. And so they were working on developing this new technology called low power wide area sensor networks. And so this is replacing the older wireless sensor networks. So previously, there are these wireless sensor networks that are really, really cool, but they were limited very much so, especially in forested areas, on their communication distances. So the idea is that you have one central gateway that controls things, and then you distribute a bunch of these motes that can communicate data, and you put sensors with them so that you can have this whole network of wireless sensors that then send their data back to a central location. And then you just need one location that has telemetry that you can collect your data remotely from. So that's great, but these wireless sensor networks in forested areas were limited to communication distances of like less than 50 meters where it was treed. And so that wasn't exactly, that's fine if you can afford lots of them, which I couldn't. So anyway, I was in contact with this company, Riot. They were claiming to have developed this low power wide area technology. So as the name implies, it can communicate data over larger areas while consuming less power than traditional wireless sensor networks. And I worked with them, and we basically rolled out a beta deployment of this LPWAN technology. And I was sort of the field guinea pig to test the performance of this in a real world setting, because they tested, driving down the highway and that kind of stuff. But we really wanted to understand how different factors like weather, topography, land cover like forest type and tree height and density affected the performance of this low power wide area sensor network, because it really hadn't been tested before. So the way this works is very similar to the wireless sensor networks. So this is looking at the Stony Mountain area, where we basically have a 30-foot tower that has the gateway on it. So it's the master in charge, and that is the expensive station that we have a cell modem and a data logger and a car battery, solar panels, and everything to keep that station running so that we can communicate with it from my home office, from campus, from anywhere. And then it's the master to the motes that are distributed across the landscape, and they're basically the slaves. So you can see I've pointed some arrows down here to where the motes are, and each mote has a cluster of sensors. So you can see this is a picture of them. Some have tipping bucket rain gauges, pressure transducers that measure water table position. We put pressure transducers in streams to measure stream stage. So we pair that with manual measurements of discharge, and essentially we can get near real-time stream flow data from these. They measure temperature, conductivity. We have soil moisture sensors installed in profile, and all of these sensors are located at each of these different modes. And so hourly, the gateway, being the master, calls out to the different motes. The motes call out to their sensors, collect the data, and send it all back to the gateway wirelessly. So then with one telemetry enabled station, you can basically collect spatially distributed hydrological information all across your catchment, which is really neat, but we didn't know how well it would work. So anyway, with the fact that we've got a bunch of these different moats and a gateway controlling them, we have essentially a number of independent lines of sight over which we can test differing terrain, topography, veg cover, different distances to assess the impact of weather conditions on system performance. So the next series of figures that I'll show are of this sort of design. So this is looking at total number of communication attempts versus a variable, like in this case is temperature. And so obviously green is good. That means we had success in communicating, and red is bad, meaning there was no communication in that temperature range. And so the bars should represent 100%. So the proportion of green is the proportion of successful communications, and then any red are unsuccessful. So the trend to take away from this is the fact that so we clustered the moats into short range and long range. So these are short range moats where they're upwards of 700 meters from the gateway. So anywhere between 100 to 700 meters, which is way longer than the wireless sensor network technology that this is trying to advance. And so I think that's awesome, but that's what we consider the short range. And what you can see is that there's quite good performance in the warm and cool temperature ranges. But then once you drop below about minus 15 degrees Celsius, we can see that the performance really drops off and we see less successful data transmission. And so this is actually in part because of battery issues more than communication distances, because once the temperature really drops, the batteries struggle to produce the voltage to actually take a measurement from the sensor. So it's more of a power issue really than a communication issue. And so in working with the tech development company Riot, they integrated cold weather circuitry into future designs to try to help combat this poor cold weather performance. But this is showing the same sort of figure, but now looking at long range. So this is from 700 meters to just shy of 2 kilometers communication distance. So this is way, way farther than wireless sensor networks are capable of. And what's interesting here, you can see the same sort of trend where cold weather performance really drops off once you hit below minus 15 or minus 20. But what's interesting on these communication lines that are upwards of 1 or 2 kilometers long is that we start to see a little bit of communication degradation in warmer air temperatures. And so when the air is much warmer, we get atmospheric perturbations that negatively influence the radio communication between the moat and the gateway. So we did see some failures at warmer temperatures as well as cold, but only over the long range, so upwards of 2 kilometers. Now, this is a similar style plot, but now looking at the influence of rainfall on communication. And this is only for the long range. So this is only for 700 to 2,000 meter communication distances, because below that in the short range area, the communication was not influenced by rainfall at all. So less than 700 meters, rainfall doesn't matter. In the long range, it does. And of course, as we move up in the rainfall intensity, we lose the number of samples we have to actually look at because there aren't that many occurrences. But we did see some communication performance drop off under more intense rainfalls and when there's just more water in the atmosphere. Now, in terms of the topography, so this is just sort of a graphical representation of what the surface topography looks like. In the middle here is the 30-foot tower. So this is the radio of the gateway up here, and then the lines of sight between it and the several moats. These are long-range moats. And you can see that this is a problematic topography where we're working. But thankfully for us, the radio communication, although it's a line of sight technology, it is not like pointing a laser, thankfully, or else we'd be in trouble. But with the radio communication, there's this thing called the Fresnel zone that develops. That's this sort of cigar-shaped area within which the radio communication bounces around. And so fortunately for us, it bounces around favorably and not reliant 100% on a line of sight. But I had a technician who we worked on developing this into a radio signal propagation model known as the Longley-Rice model, where it essentially looks at these different lines of sight between gateway and moat, and it factors in topography, factors in vegetation, landscape type and characteristics, the specific parameters of the antenna that we used, and we use different antenna configurations based upon our expected challenges, I guess, with longer term or longer distance communications using directional antenna and changing the frequencies as well. So it factors all of these radio parameters in as well as the landscape. And then it allows us to predict across the landscape what our expected radio communication strength would be. So this is again looking at Stony Mountain, and this is signal strength in RSSI, or received signal strength indicator, and minus 120 is sort of the threshold. Anything lower than that is really bad. So the blue cool colors are bad. Below 120 is pretty much no communication. And then the warmer colors and the stark red is really good communication. So upwards of minus 80 is really quite strong. So we can predict across the landscape where we have strong and where we have weak anticipated radio signal strength. And this, we like to have a laugh about this. The guys at Riot said, Scott, you're killing us here, because I went out and put everything in the worst possible spots. So you can see these are my moats here, down in these blue areas that have really, really bad expected radio communication. And I said, well, it's kind of too bad, because we want to know about wetlands. Wetlands are often in these topographic lows, which is bad for radio communication, but that's what we want scientifically. So we kind of laugh about that. But, one thing we're fortunate about is we had these moats also reporting RSSI values. So their received signal strength indicator values as they were communicating with the data. So it was something we're collecting. And then that allows us to compare the actual RSSI that we were seeing in the field to the modeled RSSI that we were modeling using this Longley-Rice signal propagation model. And you can see, looking in this table, that the modeled RSSI, as I said, below 120 is no communication, basically. And it was predicting much lower than what would facilitate communication in these areas where we had moats, but we were getting communication. And so we were seeing, RSSI much higher in reality than the model was able to predict. And so these radio waves just bounce around in a, fortunately for us, more favorable way for us than the propagation model predicts. So what's this, what kind of data are we collecting with this wireless sensor network, low power wide area sensor network design? So as I said, we put some of these locations, some of these moats next to streams, and we can measure stream flow basically. And so that's the kind of information that we're collecting in these headwater catchments, is stream flow and rainfall. And so that allows us to use what I think is a useful metric is the runoff ratio. So I mentioned earlier that this area is expected to have low catchment efficiencies. Same thing as a runoff ratio. It's basically the percent of rainfall that lands in a catchment that's produced as runoff. So we can do all this rainfall runoff analyses and then look at monthly runoff ratios. And for this particular catchment, they range from 30 to almost 50%. And as I mentioned, based on the regional understanding of these catchments and historical data that's been collected at the larger scale, we expect runoff ratios of 30% as sort of a high. And so right here, we're seeing 30% is lowest, upwards of 50%. And so it indicates that these areas that have these central wetlands, this area on top of Stony Mountain, might be a little hot spot for water generation in what is otherwise a water limited setting. So now, we've got this information for a whole handful of different catchments across the Stony Mountain Headwater Catchment Observatory itself, where we can start to look at all of these runoff ratios on a monthly basis, on an event by event basis. But really, the message that comes across here is that they regularly exceed 30%, which is what is expected. And they can be upwards of like 60%. And so we want to know why, under what conditions these catchments are being so productive. And so here's a little aerial image looking at one of the research sites in Stony Mountain. And you can see here, this is the central wetland, and it's flanked on both sides by sort of a tree transitional swamp areas. And then further to its perimeter are these upland areas that are dominated by little pockets of aspen stands. And those are typically seen as like big storage features in the landscape. And wetlands are generally conveyors. But now we've got landscape classifications done for all of these different catchments. So then we can start to look at the different runoff ratios that we see in these different catchments and relate it to the proportion of different landscape type that we see in the classifications. And so at the biggest lens possible, we can basically look at the runoff ratio versus the percent of wetland in a catchment. And so this is an average, seasonal average runoff ratio for a handful of catchments versus percentage of wetland. And you can see that as the wetland proportion increases, we get enhanced runoff ratios, so more efficient generation of runoff from these catchments. Now we've done some hydrograph analyses as well. So now this figure shows the runoff ratios that I just showed you at the top. And then we can break that out into the proportion of the hydrograph that's quick flow in response to rainfall events and the proportion that's attributable to base flow, where we see increasing proportion of base flow contribution to runoff responses with increasing wetland proportions. So they're really playing an important role, I think, in this landscape. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this is this whole part of the study started by trying to understand these type of processes and water exchanges, and that's what we're working on now. We're looking at like hill slope wetland connections to try to understand when the watershed actually links up and produces more runoff. Is that when we're seeing it? We want to understand the influence of antecedent conditions on the runoff efficiencies. So we've got a lot of that analyses ongoing. But ultimately, you know, when it comes back to resource extraction and exploration in Alberta's boreal, you know, I'll bring back here the contextual challenge of collecting all that information in these headwater catchments. And this is the pathway that I mentioned that we walked. And I think I already mentioned that we basically just follow the seismic lines around. And so then that's where my research program really started to look towards some of the hydrological processes that are occurring are altered and influenced by resource extraction and exploration. And so that's why I say, you know, we're doing research across sort of a disturbance spectrum. So now the Headwater Catchment Observatory we're able to do development, disturbance, and recovery research. So I mentioned, and this is where I'll start this part of the talk, looking at some of the work that I'm doing within BERA on trying to understand the local and potentially regional influence of seismic lines on the way that water moves in this setting. Then, you know, after the exploration is done, there's in situ footprint that have a lot of linear features. And then on the extreme end, there are completely reconstructed catchments after open pit mining. I mentioned I'm doing some wildfire science, but I won't focus on that really today. So under the context of my work within BERA, you know, as I said, we use these seismic lines to walk around to study, you know, the natural processes in the catchments. But if you squint and look at this photo, you can see this is actually one of the gateways that I mentioned. That's a 30-foot tower there. And this maybe will give you an appreciation for the challenging radio communication technology, because the close moats are back here in this valley here. So those are the short moats. So this is quite a challenging setting for communication technology. But anyway, we use these seismic lines to get around. Now we want to understand maybe their influence on the local hydrological conditions, and if those influences are apparent at the catchment scale. So just a brief overview, you probably gathered, but a seismic line is a linear corridor. You can see here, that's cleared of vegetation to facilitate resource exploration. So they basically, it allows access to seismic equipment so that they can map out the subsurface deposits of bitumen. There are tons of these in northern Alberta. There's over 1 million kilometers, and the density on average is 1.5 linear kilometers per square kilometer. But in areas where they do intensive mapping, they have these 3D and 4D, being that they rescan them, but basically a network of very dense but more narrow lines. They can be upwards of 40 linear kilometers per square kilometer. So there's a really sort of ubiquitous network of these seismic lines across the Alberta, the northern part of Alberta. And so that's what I'm working on within BERA, is to understand the influence that these have on the soil hydrophysical properties and the local hydrological conditions. And then I'll show you a little bit about the influence that they have on snow accumulation, because now, you've removed the tree canopy in order to clear the corridor to make the seismic line. Well, the trees intercept a lot of overwinter snowfall, which is then typically, a lot of that is lost back to the atmosphere through sublimation. And so we sort of hypothesize that maybe there's more snow accumulating on these seismic lines. And what does that mean? Is that an effect that we can see at the catchment scale? So I've got a couple of students within BERA, and a couple of them are ABINET students who are actually at LMU now, that I'm co-supervising and working with Ralph on and Greg on supervising various research projects that look at some of these questions that I've got on here and that I've alluded to. So do seismic lines influence the way that water moves? Is it apparent at the local scale or the catchment scale? Do soil properties change, and how much? And what does that mean for the local hydrological conditions? Is there an influence on snow processes? Is microtopography in wetlands impacted? Can we quantify this using remote sensing technologies? So that's something that one of the master's students at LMU is looking at. How much light is available for seedling regrowth? I sort of mentioned earlier that wolves use these lines to predate caribou. So we really want to regenerate vegetation to slow the wolves down, but we need to know what controls the vegetation regeneration. So that's another MSc student at LMU that's looking at that type of question. So I'll focus here a little bit on one of the master's students at the University of Calgary, who's working with Greg and Maria and I and Ralph as well, looking at the local influence of seismic lines. And so this is a map looking at one of her study sites. And you can see this by the name. This is a ridge. So this is an upland area. This is a seismic line that is cut down through it along a slope through a transition zone. And then it crosses a rich fen wetland and then back up another slope. And so the design of her study is that, we've got paired measurements on and off the line where we can compare the properties on and off the line. And also we sampled at the edge of the line. So the data that I'll be showing you is including the center, the edge, and then in the adjacent ecosystem, so that we can see what the reference should be. And so this is looking at soil hydrophysical properties, starting with bulk density. Now, this is something we already knew about, that this had been documented in the literature. Bulk density was expected to increase on seismic lines. This is only looking at organic soils and peat. And we found the same thing where, this is looking at the center of the line, the edge of the line, and then the adjacent natural ecosystem. You can see that the bulk density is higher in the center and the edge of the line than it is in the adjacent ecosystem. And then what hadn't been done previously was measurements in the rooting zone, so a little bit deeper in the soil profile, 10 to 15 centimeters. These are surface samples, and the same set of data looking at bulk density in the center, the edge, and the adjacent ecosystem. So this is all from my master's student Lilia's work. And she saw, a decrease in bulk density as you move away from the line. So an increased bulk density on the line. And that's because we saw an actual depression of the surface of the line caused by compression by the line clearing and by the subsequent equipment access. But what hadn't been looked at before was the effect that these changes in bulk density had for other important soil hydrophysical properties. And that includes what's listed here as KSAP, but saturated hydraulic conductivity. So that's sort of the ease at which water can move through a substrate. And the bulk density we saw increased on the line, which meant that there was more compression, and squeezing these organic soils like that causes a subsequent reduction in the ease at which water can move through it. So that's reflected in a reduced saturated hydraulic conductivity. And you can see this is on a log scale because hydraulic conductivity varies by orders of magnitude, but the point being, it's lowest on the line and it is higher in the adjacent natural system. And then the same thing is above, where that trend is apparent both at the surface and maybe in an enhanced way, even in the rooting zone. So we see lower hydraulic conductivity on the line than in the adjacent system. Now, I mentioned that's only for organic soils that I'm showing here, but we also measured it for mineral and sort of mixed soils as well. And then we can regress like a log transformed hydraulic conductivity against the bulk density to start to understand which soils are most sensitive to changes in bulk density from a hydraulic conductivity perspective. And you can see up here is the cluster of organic soils that are really have a strong slope, where a little change in the bulk density really causes a large decrease in the hydraulic conductivity. And that's because these organic soils are highly compressible. And then we see less of a relationship or less of an impact of enhanced bulk density on hydraulic conductivity, but we still see the same trend where an increase in bulk density reduces the hydraulic conductivity. So those are some of the hydrophysical property changes that we see locally at the line scale in the soils. But as I mentioned, we're also really interested in what happens with the snow accumulation patterns. So this picture shows the seismic line in the winter, obviously, and you can see the snow. And as I mentioned before, there's a lack of tree canopy, which removes essentially the interception of snow over the winter, a proportion of which is sublimated back to the atmosphere. So we hypothesized that more snow would end up accumulating over the course of the winter on the lines because of this. And so Lilia went out in the late winter, early spring to do a number of snow surveys to try to quantify this. And so she basically traversed along these seismic lines and measured in cross transects the snow depth, density, and ultimately the snow water equivalent, or SWE, on and off the line. So how the line compared to adjacent ecosystems. So that's what we're looking at here is snow depth versus the center edge and adjacent natural ecosystem. And you can see the median line within this box plot, it's higher snow depth on the line than off of the line. And then we did measurements of snow density as well. So it seems like the differences in density are greater, where we see a much denser snowpack on the line than off the line, presumably a result of midwinter melt rates causing densification of the snowpack. But ultimately now I've swapped the bottom figure to show snow water equivalent, so how much water is stored within the snowpack on and off the line. And what you can see is that there is a greater amount of water stored on the line in the snowpack than off of the line.
Scott, can I just interrupt here for 1 second? So thank you so far. It is 10 o'clock.
Okay.
I just want to gauge, we have till 10:15, so we have 15 more minutes. I just want to gauge if you think we can spend a little bit of time towards the end also for questions. So I just want to sort of give you sort of indication what time it is so that you could maybe allow some time for questions.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that, Julia, and I don't have much more to work through here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So with that note of the local study on the hydrophysical properties and then the local influence on snow accumulation done by Lilia, we've got a PhD student who's at the University of Waterloo with Maria Strack, and we're working on trying to understand if these influences are apparent at the catchment scale as well. So that's Miriam Miriam's PhD project, where she's got energy budget stations that we've set up on and off the line and in a similar paired approach, so that we can try to understand water and energy fluxes and how they're influenced by seismic lines. And then ultimately, when she's working, she's still at the early stages of her PhD, but ultimately we'd like to be able to have a model at the catchment scale where she can sort of toggle on and off seismic lines. And that would then, we could see, hopefully, if the lines are apparent at the catchment scale. So moving through the exploration and again into just a brief overview of the infrastructure, we've got this project that I mentioned that's at an in situ facility north of Fort McMurray, where we've got lots of linear features, including and most predominantly this big mineral road that you see the picture of here. And it basically traverses across directly perpendicular to the direction of flow. And this project's just starting now, but what we hope to evaluate and understand is the varying influence of this road on the different wetland types, so that we can better understand which wetland types are most sensitive to this type of infrastructure, and then hopefully guide future infrastructure projects away from that wetland type. I won't go into the details because there aren't many data to show, but we basically are just starting our field season coming up this year. We've got eddy covariance stations we're going to put out in transects of wells and piezometers to understand the hydrological influence. And then we're also looking at carbon exchanges with Maria Strack and plant community composition. And Greg's involved as well on looking at a sort of space for time at a different facility to look at the temporal aspect of the development of the influence of these features on the ecosystems. And we've got a master's student right now at LMU with Ralph Nicholas, who's looking at using radar interferometry for mapping surface deformation, potentially attributable to water impoundment caused by the road. I won't spend long on this because I know we want to move on, but this is the last bit here where I'm working in the open pit surface mineable area on reclamation. So this arrow is pointing down to the lake that you see here, which is an oil sands pit lake. So I mentioned it's an aquatic capping designed that's going to be integrated into their reclamation and closure design plans if it works. It's already integrated into there and we're testing if it's working. And they basically built an upland and we're evaluating the water and energy fluxes from that and how they relate to the conditions within the lake. And then hopefully can scale up to the commercial scale and provide information on the key attributes of the system that are sensitive to changing the scale to commercial scale. As a part of that, we're able to do work on regional reference lakes so that we can place the performance of the constructed lake in the context of natural boreal lakes, including 2 lakes on Stony Mountain. So we've got these regional reference lakes that we've also got energy budget stations set up on that we're monitoring lake conditions and lake levels, again, so we can compare the conditions in the constructed lake, which is the top plot here, Lake Mawasson, to the range, like hopefully we're able to bracket the range of natural lakes, including a hypersaline lake. And so far it looks like Lake Mawasson, the constructed lake, it's responding like a lower order watershed, which isn't super surprising, but a really steep response to rainfall and a gradual recession when. So my summary here, basically, we saw that this low power wide area sensor network can provide an option for remotely collecting data in near real time at a number of different locations, better actual than modeled performance. But honestly, I think a local storage option would be nice because we do have data losses when the communication fails, and that results in no data. And so a local storage option would be good for that, but allows us to really start to evaluate some of these trends across a number of catchments related to landscape composition, and then understand the influence that the seismic exploration footprint has on the way that water moves through soil hydrophysical properties, snow accumulation patterns, and then again, working in an in situ facility and an open pit facility as a part of my larger research program. So that was sort of an overview of all the different sites and research that I have going on in the mid to lower reaches of the Athabasca River Basin. So thanks very much for your time and paying attention today, and welcome any questions.